on this land after, it's now bulldozed, so. No, and that's why every time anything changes, everybody has a different perspective and different background. And if you're, like, I look how long it took me to develop seeing beauty in undisturbed areas. It took a long time. And then once you start seeing it, you recognize the delicacy, the innate delicacy, of it. You just can't, like you're talking plantation, I can go plant a plantation, but I can't go plant a forest.
Yeah.
Not in my lifetime or my grandson's lifetime. That richness of forest, like, I'm not going to see. So you have to think of it philosophically. Do I leave it? If you leave it undisturbed, sooner or later, things will happen. It just not might be in your lifetime.
Did the MR give you a reason for only wanting to plant green ash?
At the time, and I'm not, to be fair to M&R, 1990, that's the way they thought. They thought the only reason for woodlots to exist was to be a monetary function.
Yeah, so
Just like I said 5 years ago, I wouldn't have said to an M&R person that I'm managing my forest for biodiversity. That wouldn't have been allowed under the managed taxed forest
Yeah,
regime.
MFTIP.
And they had that much say in where you live, like where I'm from, no one would have even considered talking to them about what they were going to plant in the bush.
Well, this was done under the Ag Canada 1990 farm program. They were encouraging us to take like gore lots or tough land out of production. And times were difficult in farming then, so it was Ag Canada's way of funneling money down to farmers under duress. And but M&R got to manage the program.
Yeah.
Why they ever came up with the monoculture, and I talked to them at the time, and I had no idea the ash borer was coming along, but they just, because I think they had contracted that work out to private parties, just like I was reading this book, Charlotte Gill, she's a tree planter it's Dirt, the title's called Dirt, just finished it yesterday. And she talks about replanting forests in British Columbia for the third time. There's a gap there between harvesting the land and restoring it. And the longer the trail gets, the less the connection seems to be returned. Not that you ever can return the landscape to its original. But I'm dragging this on a little bit. But yeah, I just thought the M&R is there to create and churn money, as opposed to, now they've changed. They have, just like, I'm not afraid to say now, I'm managing for biodiversity.
Yeah.
Now they wouldn't go along with the monoculture. So it's just like Urca, when I started planting trees with Essex Region Conservation, their only idea of a tree program was cedar and spruce, and that's probably what you got caught up. Now they certainly discourage you from doing that. So in that sense, I look at how far we've come in 30 years, and yeah, we've had 30, 40 years, we've had progress, and are thinking about how to approach reestablishing some of the original plants back on the landscape.
Yeah, I don't know if there are any farmers in the group, but there are programs out there that you can get some, we call it cost share programs. If you did want to put a hedgerow in, you could potentially get some funding from the conservation authorities or from, some of like the Ontario Soil and Crop Association with like the Environmental Farm Plan. There's different groups out there that can help you with the cost of planting trees on your property or doing other types of work. So if you do have a rural property, you can.
Are you actually farming any of your land? Do you have any cash crops on them now?
Yep. Oh yes. Corn, wheat, and beans are the main cash crops.
Okay.
And I've been sort of waiting for someone to ask me about pesticides.
Yeah.
Because
Go for it.
I don't know, maybe someone else is
I
better
was a bit
equipped
curious about, your management practices.
for pesticides.
Yeah, like, yeah.
In the past, I have used insecticides, which I dislike doing intensely, because I am a beekeeper, I always have been, and my concern is, how do I do this without killing them? And yet, I have used, 10 years ago, we had a problem with mites, aphids, soybean beetle, and I did use some herbicides or insecticides I don't like. And because I sprayed early in the morning, because I knew that the bees were not using the flowers as a pollen nectar source, I'd either spray early in the morning or late into the evening. I've never had on my farm an insecticide kill or a poison kill. I like the idea of windbreaks, and because I keep my bees separate, and I've always placed my bees into settings with acres of distance between, like in the woodlot, there's a 30-acre area around where my beehives are. On the other farm, there was a 10-acre severance between when I started using herbicide or insecticides and where I kept my bees. And the other thing is, I think I always had such a great source of nectar that they didn't have to go off into these fields. Now, I'm still worried about them. And now that we're coming up with the systemic seed treatment, I asked questions about them, the neonicotinoids, and they're supposed to be harmless, but they're systemic. And anything that's systemic, I start to be concerned about, because that goes up into the plant and hangs there. How long? I don't know. I asked La Coop or her crop rep just before 2 weeks before I came here, and I asked them their take on using pesticides near beehives. And so he called the chemical company. And the chemical company, his answer to the rep was, who is it that is calling and why do they want to know? And so right away I'm saying, that's a non-answer. Well, to me it's an answer that wants me to ask more questions. Just like BT corn or they're stacking these corns full of insect-resistant elements. The thing is, it's all in the plant. So if and a lot of these pollinators use the plant as a caterpillar feeding station. So yeah, instead of being less concerned with some of the, I would say, uglier insecticides I did use in the 90s, in some ways I'm a little more fearful today because everything is systemic, and I don't know of anybody doing really rigorous studies on that. Just like I said, in Essex County, no one's keeping any type of record of pollination or pollinator levels. It's like they don't exist. Species where you go into species at risk paper, and there's not one bee on there.
There's not.
And it's just a gap.
Getting there. But there is something work done now with the neonicotinoids. It's becoming a huge issue. There has been a lot of suspected bee poisonings, and there's not a whole lot of proof for direct, like spray today, dead this afternoon, but it seems to be sublethal effects. So it's not killing them today, but over time it's weakening them, either poisoning them in the long term or causing some problems, like, for example, screwing out their navigational systems and their memory, so they can't actually go out or they can't process their food. So there is issues. And so there's been some work done now with all the honeybee issues. They're sort of starting to study it now, but there's still a lot of questions. And they have been showing a lot of these systemic pesticides persist in soil for several years, and they'll find residues in the plant several years later. And I was involved with some work looking at crop rotation. So they used treated seeds for potatoes, and then so they tested it in the potatoes. Okay, the pollinators generally don't visit potato flowers. A few things will, but generally they're not very good. So there's not a whole lot of worries for potatoes. The concern was, like, the next year or 2 years later, we start getting into clovers, what's happening then? And they're finding it was still persistent, still present in tiny levels, 2 or 3 or 4 years later in some of the plant tissues. So again, you sort of wonder, it's not killing them off immediately, perhaps there's something else going on, so.
Well, that's what I have a friend, Tom Condon, he runs about 1,500 hives out of Essex. He pollinates the orchards in Kingsville area and moves them up to Mount Forest. But he's concerned more about the sublethal effects on the hive than a more dramatic, sudden, acute kill.
And one other comment, just jumping in, you're talking about honeybees too. One concern with the native bees is that the native bees aren't 2 or 3 acres away from the fields necessarily. They could be immediately adjacent to the field edge where it's happening. They could be in that 5-meter hedgerow. And so the sort of question of the beekeeper may know enough to keep his honeybees away, when it's spraying, or make sure he's frontal even honeybees, but what about the native bees that are right next to the field? And as I joke, they're not reading the label or the sign that says, you know, don't visit the flowers that, you know, just been sprayed, so there's still some concerns.
And isn't that a handicap then when we don't even have a good number in the population levels,
Yeah.
then it's impossible to make any statement whatsoever.
Yeah.
You have no information to go on.
I don't wanna get into a